"Sir, you need to step away from that equipment immediately. That system requires top-secret clearance." Mark Thompson didn't even pause. His weathered hands continued working inside the SIGINT Array Processing Unit, fingers moving with surgical precision through circuits that cost more than most people's houses. The security officer took another step forward, hand instinctively moving toward his radio. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. You're not authorized to touch this equipment, and you'll shut down communications for the entire Western Theater," Mark said quietly, not looking up from the fiber optic array he was realigning. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Give me 4 minutes, then you can write all the reports you want." The officer froze. Something about the way this maintenance worker spoke, the casual mention of theater-level operations, the absolute confidence in his voice made him hesitate. Mark's fingers moved like a concert pianist, each adjustment deliberate and perfect. The massive wall of blinking error lights began turning green, one by one, but the officer couldn't see what Colonel Patricia Hayes could see from the observation window above. The way Mark's hands moved wasn't luck or experience. It was muscle memory. The kind that came from designing these systems, not just fixing them. 6 weeks earlier, Marcus Thompson had walked through the gates of Fort Riverside with nothing but a duffel bag and a maintenance contract that barely covered his rent. The high desert of northern Nevada stretched endlessly in every direction, sagebrush and dust devils the only movement in a landscape that seemed forgotten by time itself. The base squatted against the horizon like a concrete mirage, its buildings painted in shades of tan that blended with the surrounding nothingness. Mark's paperwork was unremarkable. Civilian contractor, basic facility maintenance, background check cleared for public access areas only. His supervisor, Staff Sergeant Derek Sullivan, had glanced at the file with the enthusiasm of someone being handed another mundane task, another contractor to babysit, another civilian who would need constant direction and probably complain about the heat. "Thompson, Marcus," Sullivan had read aloud, pronouncing each syllable like it tasted bad. "It says here you've got experience with electrical systems and climate control. Hope you're not expecting anything fancy. We've got broken air conditioning units, faulty lighting, and about 1,000 minor repairs that the real technicians don't have time for." Mark had nodded silently, accepting the clipboard and work assignments without comment. Sullivan mistook the quiet for incompetence rather than calculation. In his 15 years of military service, he'd learned that the loudest contractors were usually the least useful, but the quiet ones were often just as problematic in their own way. They asked too many questions, wanted access to areas they didn't need to see, and generally made his job more complicated. The maintenance bay where Mark was assigned felt like a forgotten corner of an already forgotten place. Bay C sat at the far end of the industrial complex, its overhead doors facing the desert rather than the main base. The concrete floor was stained with decades of oil and coolant, and the fluorescent lights hummed with the irregular rhythm of fixtures long overdue for replacement. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was exactly what Mark needed. Invisible, unremarkable, and far from any system that might trigger uncomfortable questions about his background. For the first 2 weeks, Mark kept his head down and his mouth shut. He fixed what needed fixing, maintained what needed maintaining, and avoided any situation that might draw attention. When the ancient air conditioning unit in Building 3 finally gave up its mechanical ghost, he replaced the compressor without fanfare. When the backup generator for the enlisted quarters started throwing error codes, he tracked down the fault to a corroded sensor and swapped it out during lunch break. Small problems, simple solutions. Nothing that would make anyone look twice at the aging contractor with the calloused hands and graying temples. But Mark couldn't completely hide what he was. It showed in small ways that most people wouldn't notice. The way he diagnosed electrical faults without needing to check the manual. How he could trace complex wiring problems by touch and instinct rather than methodical testing. The casual familiarity he showed with systems that should have been foreign to a civilian maintenance worker. These weren't skills you picked up from a technical school or learned on the job. They were the kind of capabilities that came from years of working with cutting-edge technology under pressure. Corporal Tony Martinez noticed first. He'd been tasked with supervising Mark's work on a temperamental heating system in the administrative building, expecting to spend the afternoon explaining basic procedures to another clueless contractor. Instead, he watched Mark open the control panel, scan the diagnostic display for maybe 30 seconds, then go directly to a relay hidden behind 3 layers of access panels. "How'd you know it was that relay?" Martinez asked, genuinely curious. Mark had shrugged, not looking up from his work. "Symptom pattern suggested thermal cycling failure in the secondary circuit. That relay controls the backup heating elements, and when it starts failing intermittently, you get exactly the hot and cold zones they were complaining about." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but something about it bothered Martinez. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right, too precise. Most contractors would have started with the obvious problems, checked the obvious solutions, maybe called the manufacturer's tech support line. Mark had gone straight to a component that most people wouldn't even know existed, diagnosed a failure mode that wasn't in any standard troubleshooting guide. Private First Class Kevin Walsh had his own moment of unease a few days later. He'd been assigned to help Mark replace some corroded wiring in the communications building, grunt work that mostly involved holding tools and moving equipment. The building housed routine administrative communications, nothing classified or sensitive, but it still required basic security protocols. Walsh had expected to spend the day explaining which areas Mark could and couldn't access, making sure the civilians stayed in the approved work zones. Instead, Mark seemed to... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I already know the building's layout better than Walsh did. He navigated the basement utility corridors without hesitation, knew which doors led to restricted areas without being told, and demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the building's security systems that made Walsh uncomfortable. When they reached the main electrical panel, Mark immediately identified which circuits controlled what systems, even though the labels were faded, and several had been changed over the years. "You worked on military bases before?" Walsh asked, trying to sound casual. "A few," Mark replied, his tone neutral and uninformative. It wasn't much of an answer, but something in Mark's voice suggested that pushing for details wouldn't be welcome. Walsh filed the observation away with a growing collection of small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up to anything concrete, but definitely added up to something. Staff Sergeant Sullivan remained oblivious to these undercurrents for several more days. His attention was focused on bigger problems, like the ongoing issues with Building 7 Alpha's environmental systems. The secure communications facility was experiencing intermittent climate control failures that were starting to affect the sensitive equipment housed inside. 3 different contractor teams had attempted repairs over the past month, each one more expensive and less successful than the last. The building itself was a testament to military engineering paranoia. Constructed with reinforced concrete walls, 3 feet thick, electromagnetic shielding built into every surface, and environmental controls more precise than most hospital operating rooms. The equipment inside was worth tens of millions of dollars and classified at levels that required extensive background investigations just to see the outside of the cases. The fact that a simple HVAC problem was threatening these systems was becoming a source of embarrassment for everyone involved. Sullivan had been specifically ordered to keep all non-essential personnel away from Building 7 Alpha, while the latest repair team worked on the problem. That included civilian contractors like Mark, who weren't cleared for anything beyond basic facility access. The order was clear and non-negotiable, which made it particularly frustrating when Sullivan discovered Mark standing outside the building's service entrance on a Tuesday morning, tool bag in hand. "Thompson, what the hell are you doing here?" Sullivan's voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose authority had been challenged. Mark looked up from the clipboard he'd been studying. "Environmental control fault in the main server room." Work order came through this morning. Sullivan snatched the clipboard and scanned the paperwork. It was legitimate, properly signed and authorized, but something felt wrong. The work order had come from Captain Jennifer Lee's office, but Sullivan hadn't been notified. In the military's careful hierarchy of responsibility, that was unusual enough to be suspicious. "Nobody told me about this," Sullivan said, his tone suggesting that this was Mark's fault rather than an administrative oversight. "Maybe they figured it was routine maintenance," Mark replied with a shrug. "Just replacing some sensors and checking the backup systems." The explanation was reasonable, but Sullivan's instincts were telling him something different. He'd spent enough years in the Army to recognize when situations weren't quite what they appeared to be. The timing felt off, the authorization felt rushed, and Mark's casual attitude toward working in a restricted building felt entirely too comfortable. "Wait here," Sullivan ordered, pulling out his radio to call the communications office for verification. Mark nodded and stepped back from the entrance, settling against the building's concrete wall to wait. From anyone else, the gesture would have seemed like compliance with military authority. But there was something in Mark's posture, a patience that suggested he was used to waiting for security procedures, that made Sullivan even more uneasy. The radio call confirmed that the work order was legitimate, authorized by Captain Lee herself, after consultation with Dr. James Carter, the base's technical director. The environmental systems in Building 7 Alpha were becoming increasingly unstable, and standard contractor protocols were taking too long to arrange. Mark's basic facility access was being temporarily upgraded to allow work in the building's utility areas, under direct supervision. Sullivan wasn't happy about the arrangement, but orders were orders. He badged them both through the security checkpoint, made sure Mark understood the restrictions on his access, and accompanied him to the mechanical spaces beneath the main server room. The work area was cramped and hot, filled with pipes, ducts, and electrical conduits that seemed to have been installed by someone with a personal grudge against future maintenance workers. "Sensors are mounted behind that access panel," Sullivan explained, pointing to a section of wall that looked identical to every other section. "Should be straightforward replacement, but don't touch anything else. And I mean anything." Mark nodded and began unpacking his tools, moving with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done this type of work many times before. Sullivan settled into a folding chair to supervise, expecting a routine hour of watching someone fumble through an unfamiliar repair. Instead, he found himself observing something that looked more like a surgical procedure. Mark's movements were precise and deliberate, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. He opened the access panel without needing to search for hidden latches, identified the failed sensors without consulting any documentation, and began the replacement process with a fluidity that spoke of deep familiarity with the systems. His hands never hesitated, never backtracked, never made the small mistakes that characterize someone working in an unfamiliar environment. "You've worked on this type of system before," Sullivan observed, trying to keep his tone conversational rather than suspicious. "Similar systems," Mark replied without looking up. "Most environmental controls follow the same basic principles." It was true enough, but it didn't explain the specific knowledge Mark was demonstrating. The way he adjusted the calibration settings, the casual familiarity with diagnostic protocols, the intuitive understanding of how these particular systems integrated with the building's other infrastructure. These weren't general principles. This was specific, detailed knowledge that came from extensive experience with this exact type of installation. Sullivan was still processing this observation when the building's emergency alarm system activated. Red lights began flashing in the corridor above, and the automated voice system began announcing a ventilation failure in the main server room. Through the floor, they could hear the sound of large cooling fans spinning down, followed by the distinctive beeping of equipment entering thermal protection mode. "Shit," Sullivan muttered, reaching for his radio. "Control, this is Sullivan in Building 7 Alpha. We've got a ventilation emergency in the server room. Requesting immediate technical support." The response was immediate and tense. "Sullivan, we're reading total environmental failure on all primary systems." Get your people out of there now. We're initiating emergency shutdown procedures. Mark had stopped working and was listening to the radio traffic with an expression of concern that went beyond professional interest. Emergency shutdown will take the communications array offline for at least 6 hours, he said quietly. Sullivan stared at him. How do you know that? Lucky guess, Mark replied, but his attention was already shifting to the mechanical systems around them. What if the problem isn't in the server room itself? What if it's in the primary distribution manifold? The what? Mark pointed to a section of ductwork that disappeared into the building's structural wall. The main air distribution system. If there's a blockage or damper failure in the primary manifold, it would cause exactly the symptoms you're seeing, total airflow loss, but the sensors in the server room wouldn't detect the actual cause. Sullivan's radio crackled again. All personnel evacuate Building 7 Alpha immediately. Repeat, immediate evacuation ordered. We need to go, Sullivan said, standing up and beginning to pack the tools. Mark remained crouched beside the access panel, his expression thoughtful. Give me 2 minutes to check the manifold access. If I'm right, this is a 15-minute fix instead of a 6-hour shutdown. Are you insane? We have direct orders to evacuate. Besides, you don't have clearance to access any other systems in this building. The manifold access is in the utility corridor, Mark replied, still within my authorized work area. And if I'm wrong, we leave and nothing's lost. But if I'm right. He let the sentence hang, but the implication was clear. 6 hours of communications blackout versus 15 minutes of unauthorized troubleshooting. Sullivan found himself caught between military discipline and practical necessity, between following orders and potentially solving a critical problem. The decision was made for him when Captain Lee's voice came over the radio. Sullivan, what's the status of your maintenance work down there? We need to know if anything you were doing might have contributed to this failure. Sullivan looked at Mark, who was already moving toward the corridor that led to the manifold access. Captain, my contractor thinks he might know what's causing the problem. Requesting permission to investigate before we evacuate. There was a pause, filled with the sound of overlapping radio traffic and increasingly urgent status reports from the server room. How long? Lee finally asked. 2 minutes for diagnosis, maybe 15 for repair if he's right. Another pause. Approved, but I want constant updates. And Sullivan? If this gets worse, you get out immediately. Mark was already working his way through a maintenance crawl space that led to the building's main air distribution system. The space was barely large enough for a person, filled with pipes and cables that seemed designed to snag clothing and skin. Sullivan followed reluctantly, his radio crackling with updates from the increasingly frantic technical teams upstairs. They emerged into a small mechanical room that housed the primary air handling equipment for the entire building. Mark went directly to a large control panel mounted on the far wall, his movements betraying a familiarity that made Sullivan's unease spike into genuine alarm. This wasn't guesswork or general knowledge. Mark knew exactly where to look and what to look for. There, Mark said, pointing to a status display that showed a damper position indicator locked in the closed position. Primary intake damper failed closed, probably due to a motor control relay failure. The system's trying to pull air through the secondary intakes, but they're not sized to handle full building load. He opened a control panel that should have been locked, accessing diagnostic systems that weren't covered in any civilian maintenance manual. His fingers moved across the interface with practiced ease, calling up system logs and error histories that painted a clear picture of the failure progression. Motor control relay in position 7, Mark announced, already moving toward a bank of electrical panels. Failed about 20 minutes ago, probably due to thermal cycling stress. Should have been replaced during the last scheduled maintenance, but these relays don't usually give much warning before they go. Sullivan watched in fascination and growing alarm as Mark located the failed component, tested it with a multimeter, and began the replacement process. Every movement was efficient and precise, demonstrating a level of system knowledge that went far beyond anything a civilian contractor should possess. Thompson, where exactly did you learn to work on this type of equipment? Mark paused in his work, looking up with an expression that was carefully neutral. Previous job. Did a lot of work with environmental control systems. What kind of previous job? Government contractor. Different agency, similar equipment. It was another non-answer, but before Sullivan could push for more details, Mark had completed the relay replacement and was cycling the damper system back online. The distinctive sound of large air handlers spinning up filled the mechanical room, followed by the more subtle noise of airflow returning to normal throughout the building. Sullivan's radio immediately came alive with reports from the server room. Airflow restored, temperature stabilizing, all systems returning to normal operation. Captain Lee's voice cut through the chatter. "Sullivan, what's your status down there?" "Problem identified and corrected, Captain. Faulty motor control relay in the primary air intake system. My contractor was able to effect repairs without impacting any classified systems. Outstanding work. Have your contractor submit a detailed report on the failure and repair procedures. And Sullivan? Make sure he gets a commendation for this." That kind of quick thinking saved us a major operational disruption. Sullivan acknowledged the order and looked at Mark, who was already packing up his tools with the same methodical efficiency he'd shown throughout the repair. But something had changed in the past hour. The way Mark had moved through the building's systems, the intuitive knowledge he'd displayed, the casual familiarity with equipment that most people would never see in their entire careers. "That wasn't luck, was it?" Sullivan asked quietly. Mark shouldered his tool bag and headed toward the exit. Sometimes experience looks like luck to people who haven't seen it before. As they made their way back through the building's security checkpoints, Sullivan found himself studying Mark with new attention. The quiet contractor who'd seemed unremarkable just a few hours ago was beginning to look like something else entirely. Someone with knowledge and capabilities that didn't match his official file. Someone whose background contained gaps that were starting to feel deliberately obscured rather than simply incomplete. But it wasn't until they reached the outside of Building 7 Alpha that Sullivan noticed they weren't alone. Colonel Patricia Hayes was standing near the entrance, her expression thoughtful as she watched Mark emerge from the secure facility. She'd been observing from the administrative building when the emergency began, and she'd seen enough of Mark's work through the security monitors to draw her own conclusions about his capabilities. "Mr. Thompson," she called out as they approached, "excellent work in there. I understand you diagnosed and repaired a complex system failure in under 20 minutes. Mark nodded politely. "Just a failed relay, Colonel. Nothing too complicated once you know where to look." "And you knew exactly where to look," Hayes observed. "That suggests considerable familiarity with this type of installation." "I've worked on similar systems before." Hayes studied him for a moment, her experienced eye taking in details that most people would miss. The way he stood, the way he spoke, the casual confidence he displayed when discussing technical systems that were beyond most people's comprehension. She'd spent enough years in the military to recognize when someone's background didn't match their current circumstances. "I'd like to speak with you tomorrow morning, Mr. Thompson, about your background and experience. I think there might be opportunities for additional work that would better utilize your skills." Mark's expression didn't change, but Sullivan caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Caution, maybe, or concern. "Of course, Colonel, whatever you need." As Hayes walked away, Sullivan found himself wondering what exactly he'd witnessed in the past few hours. Mark's repair work had been impressive, certainly, but it was more than that. It was the kind of performance that suggested capabilities far beyond what any civilian contractor should possess. And Colonel Hayes had clearly noticed the same inconsistencies that were beginning to trouble Sullivan. That evening, as Mark cleaned his tools in the empty maintenance bay, he allowed himself a moment of concern about the day's events. He'd managed to avoid drawing attention for 6 weeks, keeping his head down and his skills hidden. But the emergency in Building 7 Alpha had forced him to reveal capabilities that raised uncomfortable questions about his background. The work itself had been routine, the kind of repair he could have performed in his sleep during his years with the NSA. But performing it here, in front of military personnel who were trained to notice inconsistencies, had been a calculated risk, one that might have consequences he wasn't prepared to handle. As he locked up the maintenance bay and headed toward his quarters, Mark didn't notice the figure watching from the shadows near Building 7 Alpha. Colonel Hayes had returned to observe his evening routine, adding another piece to a puzzle that was becoming more intriguing by the hour. Tomorrow's conversation would be interesting indeed. Colonel Patricia Hayes arrived at her office at 0530 hours, 2 full hours before her scheduled meeting with Marcus Thompson. Sleep had been elusive after witnessing the maintenance workers' performance in Building 7 Alpha, and she'd spent most of the night reviewing security footage and personnel files. What she'd discovered, or more accurately, what she hadn't discovered, only deepened her suspicions about the quiet contractor who'd solved $1 million problem in 20 minutes. The base was still wrapped in the pre-dawn darkness that made the Nevada desert feel infinite and hostile. Hayes preferred these early morning hours, when the compound belonged to the security patrols and the occasional insomniac. It gave her time to think without the constant interruptions that defined military command, time to process the inconsistencies that were accumulating around Marcus Thompson like storm clouds. She'd pulled Thompson's file the previous evening, expecting to find a routine background check and employment history that would explain his technical capabilities. Instead, she'd found a document that raised more questions than it answered. The file was clean, perhaps too clean, with employment gaps that were explained in vague terms and references that seemed legitimate but felt somehow manufactured. Thompson's most recent employment had been listed as facilities maintenance for a government contractor in Colorado, but when Hayes had tried to verify the details through unofficial channels, she'd encountered a wall of administrative deflection that was unusual for routine employment verification. The company existed, certainly, but their willingness to discuss former employees seemed limited by what they claimed were confidentiality agreements. His military service record was listed as none, which struck Hayes as odd for someone who moved through secure facilities with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to military protocols. His educational background showed a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from a state university, adequate for maintenance work, but hardly the kind of credentials that would explain the sophisticated diagnostic capabilities he demonstrated. Most troubling were the gaps. 3 separate periods over the past decade where Thompson's employment history became vague, explained only as consulting work for various government agencies. The dates, job descriptions, and even the agencies themselves were listed in terms so general they could have meant anything or nothing. Hayes had spent 15 years in military intelligence before taking command of Fort Riverside, and she'd learned to recognize the particular type of bureaucratic fog that surrounded people whose real work couldn't be discussed in official documents. Thompson's file had all the hallmarks of a carefully constructed cover story, professionally done but not quite perfect enough to fool someone who knew what to look for. The security footage from Building 7 Alpha told its own story. Hayes had reviewed the entire sequence 3 times, watching Thompson move through the facility's most sensitive areas with a familiarity that suggested extensive prior experience. His route to the mechanical room had been direct and purposeful, with none of the hesitation or wrong turns that would be expected from someone working in an unfamiliar environment. More revealing was his interaction with the building's security systems. Thompson had accessed control panels and diagnostic interfaces that weren't covered in any civilian maintenance manual, demonstrating knowledge of proprietary systems that were restricted to authorized personnel only. His troubleshooting methodology had been systematic and professional, following protocols that were taught in specialized training programs rather than learned through trial and error. But it was his hands that had captured Hayes' attention most completely. The way Thompson's fingers had moved across complex control interfaces, the unconscious muscle memory that guided him to the right switches and displays, the absolute confidence he'd shown when working with systems worth millions of dollars. Those weren't the hands of a maintenance worker who'd learned his skills from technical manuals. Hayes had made some discreet inquiries through her network of contacts at other installations, asking about unusual civilian contractors or personnel with questionable backgrounds. The responses had been uniformly unhelpful, but their tone had been interesting. Too many people had seemed reluctant to discuss the topic, deflecting her questions with the kind of careful non-answers that suggested they knew more than they were willing to share. The most intriguing response had come from Colonel Michael Santos at Peterson Air Force Base, who'd simply said that some contractors worked for agencies that preferred their personnel to remain invisible, and that asking too many questions about such individuals could complicate relationships with those agencies. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm Hayes' growing suspicion that Thompson's presence at Fort Riverside was more complicated than it appeared. As dawn began to lighten the eastern mountains, Hayes reviewed her strategy for the upcoming meeting. Direct confrontation would likely produce nothing but denial and deflection. Thompson had clearly been trained to maintain his cover under pressure. Instead, she would need to approach the conversation indirectly, looking for inconsistencies and reactions that might reveal more than direct questioning. At 0745 hours, Hayes' administrative assistant announced Thompson's arrival. The maintenance worker entered her office with the quiet composure she'd observed the previous day, taking the indicated chair without the nervous fidgeting that usually characterized civilians called to meet with base commanders. His clothing was clean but worn, his posture respectful but not deferential, and his expression politely attentive. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming in this morning. I wanted to personally thank you for your excellent work yesterday. Your quick thinking prevented what could have been a significant operational disruption." "Just doing my job, Colonel. I'm glad I could help." Hayes studied his face, looking for any sign of pride or satisfaction that might indicate he was unused to praise for technical work. Instead, she saw only polite acknowledgement, as if commendations for solving complex problems were routine parts of his experience. "Your approach to the problem was quite sophisticated. The diagnostic methodology you used isn't something I'd expect from standard maintenance training. Where did you learn to troubleshoot environmental control systems at that level?" Thompson's expression remained neutral, but Hayes caught a flicker of calculation in his eyes. "Previous work experience, mostly. I've been fortunate to work with some advanced systems over the years." "The government contractor work listed in your file?" "Among other positions, yes." Hayes opened Thompson's personnel folder, making a show of reviewing the documents inside. "I notice there are some gaps in your employment history. Several periods where your work is described only as consulting for various agencies. Can you be more specific about the nature of that work?" For the first time, Thompson showed a trace of discomfort. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, but Hayes had been trained to notice such reactions. "Much of that work was covered by confidentiality agreements, Colonel. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details." "Of course. But surely you can speak in general terms about the type of systems you worked with. It would help me understand how to best utilize your skills here at Fort Riverside." Thompson was quiet for a moment, and Hayes could practically see him weighing his options. Too much detail would compromise his cover, but too little would make his capabilities seem suspicious. "Communication systems mostly. Network infrastructure, signal processing equipment, environmental controls for sensitive installations. The kind of work that requires security clearances and background investigations." It was a careful answer, truthful enough to be verified, but vague enough to avoid specifics. Hayes made a note in Thompson's file, letting him see her writing something that might or might not be important. "Security clearances. What level?" "That would depend on the specific contract and the agency involved." Another deflection, but this one told Hayes more than Thompson probably intended. Someone without clearances would have simply said so. Someone with routine clearances would have mentioned the level. Only someone with high-level access would dance around the question so carefully. "I'm asking because I'm considering recommending you for additional responsibilities. Fort Riverside handles communications for several critical operations, and we're always looking for qualified personnel who can work with classified systems. But that would require updating your security status." Hayes watched Thompson's reaction carefully. Most civilian contractors would be excited by the prospect of more interesting work and higher pay. Instead, she saw something that looked like concern, quickly masked, but unmistakably present. "I appreciate the confidence, Colonel, but I'm quite satisfied with my current assignments. I prefer to keep things simple." It was an odd response from someone whose demonstrated capabilities far exceeded his current job requirements. Hayes filed that reaction away with the growing collection of inconsistencies that surrounded Marcus Thompson. "Simple can be good," she agreed. "But talent like yours shouldn't be wasted on routine maintenance. Tell me, have you ever worked with SIGINT systems?" The question was deliberately specific, designed to elicit a reaction that might reveal more than Thompson intended. She saw his hands tense slightly, an involuntary response that was gone almost immediately. "I've worked with various communication systems over the years. Signal intelligence equipment isn't uncommon in government installations." "No, I suppose it isn't. But the systems in Building 7 Alpha are quite specialized. The SIGINT Array Processing Unit you worked near yesterday represents some of the most advanced technology in the field. Not many people would recognize it, let alone understand its operational requirements." Thompson met her gaze steadily. "I was working on environmental controls, Colonel. I didn't have access to any operational systems." "Of course not. But you seemed quite familiar with the building's layout and infrastructure, almost as if you'd worked in similar facilities before. Government buildings tend to follow similar design principles. Once you've seen a few, the others become more predictable." Hayes nodded as if accepting the explanation, but she was beginning to form a clearer picture of who Marcus Thompson might really be. His answers were too polished, his deflections too practiced, and his knowledge too specific for someone with the background described in his official file. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you. Your technical capabilities are clearly beyond what would be expected from your listed experience. Your familiarity with classified systems and secure facilities suggests a background that isn't reflected in your personnel file. I'm not trying to create problems for you, but I need to understand who I have working on my base." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, and Hayes could see him struggling with how much truth he could safely reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Some people work for agencies that prefer their personnel to maintain low profiles after their service ends. Sometimes that means accepting positions that don't fully utilize their training or experience. It's not a matter of deception, Colonel. It's a matter of continuing to serve in whatever capacity is deemed appropriate." It was the most honest answer he'd given, and it confirmed much of what Hayes had suspected. Thompson was former government service, almost certainly intelligence-related, working under a cover identity that allowed him to remain productive while staying invisible. The question was, why such measures were necessary, and what agency was responsible for his current situation. "I understand the need for discretion, Mr. Thompson, but yesterday you made yourself visible in a way that may have consequences. Your work in Building 7 Alpha was observed by multiple personnel, and word of your capabilities is spreading through the base. If your current situation requires you to remain inconspicuous, that may no longer be possible." Thompson's expression showed genuine concern for the first time in their conversation. "I was just trying to help solve an urgent problem. I didn't intend to draw attention." "I know. But intention and outcome don't always align. I'm going to ask you directly, is there anything about your background or current situation that I should know? Anything that might affect base security or operations?" Hayes watched Thompson weigh his options, clearly torn between maintaining his cover and addressing her legitimate concerns as base commander. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "My previous work was with a federal agency that handles sensitive national security matters. My current situation is the result of circumstances that required me to step away from that role and assume a lower profile. I can't discuss the specifics, but I can assure you that my presence here poses no threat to base security or operations." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was progress. Hayes made another note in Thompson's file, this one a reminder to herself to make some very careful inquiries through channels that existed outside normal military bureaucracy. "Thank you for being honest with me, Mr. Thompson. I appreciate your situation, and I'll respect your need for privacy. However, I want you to understand that your actions yesterday may have attracted attention from people who are paid to notice anomalies. If there are aspects of your background that could become problematic, it would be better to address them proactively." Thompson nodded, his expression grim. "I understand, Colonel. I'll do whatever I can to avoid creating complications." "I hope that won't be necessary. But, Mr. Thompson, if circumstances change, if anyone begins asking questions about you or your work here, I want you to come to me immediately. Whatever your background, you're part of my command now, and I protect my people." The meeting concluded with polite formalities, but Hayes knew that their conversation had changed the dynamic between them. Thompson understood that she knew more than his file indicated, and she understood that his presence at Fort Riverside was more complicated than routine civilian employment. After Thompson left her office, Hayes sat quietly for several minutes, considering her options. She could pursue the matter aggressively, using her contacts and resources to dig deeper into Thompson's background. But such inquiries might trigger responses from whatever agency was responsible for his current situation, potentially creating more problems than they solved. Alternatively, she could accept Thompson's assurance that he posed no security risk and allow him to continue his work without further investigation. But that approach left too many questions unanswered, and Hayes had learned through hard experience that unanswered questions in the intelligence community had a way of becoming serious problems. She was still considering her choices when her secure phone rang with an incoming call from the Pentagon. The caller ID showed only a number, no agency or office designation, which immediately put Hayes on alert. Calls from unidentified Pentagon numbers rarely brought good news. "Colonel Hayes, this is Deputy Director Morrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency. I understand you have a civilian contractor named Marcus Thompson working at your facility." Hayes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air conditioning. "Yes, Mr. Thompson is assigned to facility maintenance. May I ask why DIA is interested in a civilian contractor? We've been monitoring electronic communications related to certain sensitive installations, and your facility was flagged for unusual activity yesterday. Our analysis suggests that someone with advanced technical knowledge accessed classified systems without proper authorization. We need to investigate this matter immediately." "Sir, I can assure you that all classified systems at Fort Riverside are properly secured. Any maintenance work is conducted under direct supervision with appropriate clearances. Colonel, I'm not questioning your security procedures, but we have indicators that suggest someone with extensive knowledge of intelligence community systems was active at your location yesterday. We're sending a team to investigate, and they'll need to interview all personnel who had access to Building 7 Alpha during the time frame in question." Hayes closed her eyes, realizing that her worst fears about Thompson's visibility were already becoming reality. "When should I expect your team to arrive?" "They're already en route. Agent Mitchell and Agent Chen from Homeland Security will be conducting the initial interviews under DIA oversight. They should arrive at your facility within the hour." The call ended, leaving Hayes staring at her phone and contemplating the rapidly deteriorating situation. Thompson's attempt to help had indeed attracted exactly the kind of attention he'd presumably been trying to avoid. Within hours, federal agents would be questioning everyone who'd witnessed his work, and maintaining his cover would become infinitely more difficult. Hayes immediately called her administrative assistant and ordered a secure meeting with her senior staff. If federal agents were going to be interrogating her personnel, she needed to understand exactly what they might discover and how to protect her people from bureaucratic overreach. She also needed to warn Thompson about what was coming, though she suspected he might already know. People with his apparent background usually had ways of monitoring official interest in their activities. The question was whether he would run or stay to face whatever consequences were heading his way. As Hayes prepared for what was likely to be a very difficult morning, she reflected on the irony of the situation. Thompson's expertise had saved Fort Riverside from a significant operational disruption, but demonstrating that expertise might destroy whatever new life he'd been trying to build in the Nevada desert. The morning sun was fully up now, painting the base's concrete buildings in shades of gold and amber that made them seem almost welcoming. But Hayes knew that by afternoon, Fort Riverside would be swarming with federal agents asking uncomfortable questions about a maintenance worker who'd proven to be far more than he appeared. In his quarters across the base, Marcus Thompson was packing a small travel bag with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. He'd spotted the unmarked vehicles approaching the main gate 20 minutes earlier, and he recognized the particular combination of government plates and tinted windows that meant his careful anonymity had finally been compromised. He'd known this day would come eventually. The work in Building 7 Alpha had been a calculated risk, but one he'd felt was necessary to prevent a communications blackout that could have had serious operational consequences. Now that risk was generating exactly the kind of official attention he'd spent the past 3 years trying to avoid. Thompson finished packing and sat on the edge of his narrow bed, considering his limited options. He could attempt to leave the base before the federal agents arrived, but running would only confirm their suspicions and make his situation worse. He could stay and maintain his cover, but his performance yesterday had been too visible and too sophisticated to explain away with routine maintenance training. The third option was the most dangerous, but potentially the most honest. He could reveal enough of his real background to satisfy the investigators, while hoping that his former agency would intervene to protect his cover. It was a gamble that could result in his being brought back into active service whether he wanted it or not, but it might be the only way to avoid federal prosecution for unauthorized access to classified systems. As Thompson contemplated these unhappy choices, he heard the sound of vehicles stopping outside the building that housed his quarters. Through his window, he could see 2 sedans with government plates and the distinctive posture of federal agents preparing to conduct interviews. His phone buzzed with an incoming text message from Colonel Hayes. "Federal agents here to investigate yesterday's incident. Come to my office immediately." Thompson deleted the message and shouldered his travel bag. Whatever happened next, his time as an anonymous maintenance worker at Fort Riverside was over. The only question was whether his next identity would be prisoner, fugitive, or reluctant government employee. As he walked toward the administrative building, Thompson reflected on the cruel irony that his attempt to help had triggered the very exposure he'd been trying to avoid. But perhaps it was time to stop running from a past that seemed determined to catch up with him, regardless of how carefully he tried to remain invisible. The federal agents were already setting up their interview station when Thompson arrived at the administrative building. He could see them through the windows, professional and methodical as they arranged recording equipment and prepared the documentation that would either clear him or destroy whatever remained of his carefully constructed new life. Colonel Hayes was waiting for him in the corridor outside her office, her expression grim but determined. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to protect you from bureaucratic overreach. But I need you to be completely honest with me about who you are and why federal agents are here asking questions about you." Thompson met her gaze and made his decision. "Colonel, my name is Dr. Marcus Thompson, and until 3 years ago I was a senior technical operations specialist with the National Security Agency. I'm here because people I trusted betrayed that trust, and staying invisible was the only way to stay alive." Hayes nodded grimly. "Then we'd better figure out how to keep you that way." Agent Sarah Mitchell had conducted thousands of interviews during her 12 years with Homeland Security, but she'd never encountered a subject who radiated such controlled tension while maintaining perfect outward calm. Marcus Thompson sat across from her in the base conference room, hands folded loosely in his lap, expression politely attentive, yet every instinct she'd developed told her she was looking at someone who could disappear from federal custody within minutes if he chose to do so. The man's personnel file lay open on the table between them, a document that had already raised more red flags than a Soviet military parade. Thompson's background check had come back clean, almost aggressively clean, with employment references that verified under scrutiny but felt manufactured under deeper investigation. His educational credentials were legitimate but unremarkable, his work history plausible but curiously generic, and his personal life practically non-existent. Agent Robert Chen sat beside Mitchell, tablet in hand, ready to cross-reference Thompson's statements against the extensive database they'd compiled during their flight from Washington. Their preliminary research had uncovered digital footprints that suggested Thompson's official identity was relatively recent, created with the kind of professional expertise that indicated government involvement rather than criminal fraud. "Mr. Thompson," Mitchell began, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality that made subjects comfortable enough to reveal more than they intended. "We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us this morning. We understand you were involved in maintenance work at Building 7 Alpha yesterday." Thompson nodded once. "That's correct. Environmental control system repairs in the mechanical spaces." "Can you walk us through exactly what you did during that work period?" Thompson's account was detailed and technically precise, describing his diagnosis of the damper relay failure and subsequent repair with the kind of specificity that demonstrated genuine expertise. Mitchell noticed that his explanation never strayed from the mechanical aspects of the work, carefully avoiding any mention of the sophisticated diagnostic procedures she'd observed in the security footage. "The repair required accessing several control systems," Chen interjected. "Systems that aren't typically covered in civilian maintenance training. Where did you learn to work with those particular interfaces?" "Previous experience with similar equipment. Government contractors often work with standardized systems across multiple installations." Mitchell had heard variations of that answer from dozens of subjects over the years, and she'd learned to recognize when someone was telling the truth while carefully omitting crucial details. Thompson was clearly experienced with the equipment he'd worked on, but his familiarity went beyond routine maintenance training. "Mr. Thompson, our technical analysis of yesterday's incident indicates that someone with extensive knowledge of intelligence community systems accessed classified interfaces without proper authorization. The diagnostic procedures used were consistent with NSA technical protocols, not civilian maintenance standards." For the first time, Thompson's expression showed a flicker of genuine surprise. Mitchell caught the reaction and filed it away as significant. Someone with routine contracting experience wouldn't understand the implications of NSA protocol recognition, but someone with intelligence community background would realize immediately what that meant for their cover. "I followed standard troubleshooting procedures," Thompson replied carefully. "If those procedures happen to resemble NSA protocols, it's probably because effective diagnostic methodology is fairly universal." Chen leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Thompson, we've analyzed the security footage from Building 7 Alpha. Your movements through that facility showed familiarity with classified systems and restricted areas that suggests previous experience with similar installations. Can you explain that familiarity?" Thompson was quiet for several seconds, and Mitchell could see him calculating his options. His body language remained controlled, but there was a subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was preparing for a more aggressive line of questioning. "I've worked in secure government facilities before. The layout and security protocols tend to be similar across different installations." "Which facilities?" Mitchell asked immediately. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics of previous contracts. Many government positions require confidentiality agreements that remain in effect after employment ends." It was another deflection, but this one told Mitchell more than Thompson probably realized. Standard civilian contractors didn't typically work under confidentiality agreements that prevented them from even naming their previous employers. That level of operational security was reserved for personnel with access to classified information or sensitive intelligence operations. Mitchell opened a folder and withdrew a series of photographs showing Thompson's work in the mechanical room. The images had been captured by security cameras and enhanced by technical analysts, clearly showing his interaction with control systems that weren't supposed to be accessible to civilian personnel. "Mr. Thompson, these photographs show you accessing diagnostic interfaces that require specialized knowledge and authorization codes. The system logs indicate that these interfaces were accessed using administrative privileges that shouldn't have been available to someone with your clearance level. How do you explain that access?" Thompson studied the photographs carefully, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts. When he looked up, Mitchell saw something different in his eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "The interfaces I accessed were necessary to diagnose the system failure. If those accesses exceeded my official authorization, it was because the emergency situation required immediate action to prevent a critical system failure. But how did you know the authorization codes? How did you know which interfaces to access? That information isn't available in any maintenance manual. Thompson met her gaze steadily. Sometimes experience provides knowledge that isn't documented in official procedures. Chen pulled up additional files on his tablet. Mr. Thompson, we've been investigating unusual electronic signatures around several military installations over the past 2 years. The signature pattern from yesterday's incident matches patterns we've observed at 3 other locations, where advanced technical work was performed by personnel who shouldn't have had the necessary knowledge or access. Mitchell watched Thompson's reaction to this revelation. She saw his hands tense slightly, a micro-expression of concern that was gone almost immediately. Someone with routine contracting experience wouldn't understand the implications of signature pattern analysis, but someone with intelligence background would realize that federal agencies had been tracking him for months. "I don't know anything about electronic signatures or pattern analysis," Thompson said. "I've worked at several military installations over the past few years, doing routine maintenance and repair work. If there are similarities in my work, it's because effective repair techniques tend to be consistent. The installations in question are all involved in intelligence community operations," Chen continued. "Peterson Air Force Base, Naval Communications Station Norfolk, and Fort Meade. All 3 reported incidents where civilian contractors performed technical work that exceeded their official capabilities. All 3 incidents involved the same diagnostic methodologies and system access patterns we observed yesterday." Thompson's composure remained steady, but Mitchell caught another flicker of reaction. Someone who'd worked at Fort Meade would know that it housed NSA headquarters, and the mention of that location had clearly struck a nerve. "I may have worked at some of those installations," Thompson admitted. "Government contractors often work at multiple sites as contracts require." Mitchell leaned back in her chair, studying Thompson with renewed attention. His admission was carefully phrased, but represented a significant shift from his previous denials. Someone was forcing him to acknowledge connections he'd been trying to conceal. "Mr. Thompson, Fort Meade isn't just another military installation. It's the headquarters of the National Security Agency. Civilian contractors who work there undergo extensive background investigations and sign agreements that restrict their future employment options. Are you telling us you worked at NSA headquarters as a routine maintenance contractor?" Thompson was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his response. Mitchell could see him struggling with how much truth he could safely reveal, without compromising whatever protection his current identity provided. "I've worked at various government installations over the years. Some of those installations housed intelligence operations. The specific nature of my work at those locations is covered by agreements that prevent me from discussing details." Chen pulled up another file on his tablet. "Mr. Thompson, we've run your name through federal employment databases. Marcus Thompson appears in contractor records starting approximately 3 years ago. Before that date, there are no federal employment records, no tax filings, no credit history, and no Social Security activity. It's as if Marcus Thompson didn't exist before 2021. Mitchell watched Thompson's reaction to this information. His expression remained controlled, but she could see the tension building behind his careful facade. Someone with a legitimately constructed identity wouldn't be surprised by employment verification, but someone operating under a cover identity would understand the implications of database analysis. "Records get lost sometimes," Thompson said. "Government bureaucracy isn't perfect." "Mr. Thompson," Mitchell said, "we're not talking about lost paperwork. We're talking about a complete absence of documentation for someone who claims to have worked in government contracting for over a decade. That level of invisibility requires professional expertise and official resources." Thompson met her gaze directly, and for the first time Mitchell saw something approaching honesty in his expression. "Some government positions require personnel to maintain low profiles after their service ends. If my documentation appears incomplete, it may be because complete documentation would compromise ongoing operations or personnel security." It was the most revealing statement he'd made, and Mitchell immediately understood its implications. Thompson was acknowledging that his current identity was cover, maintained by an agency that needed to keep his real background concealed. The question was why such measures were necessary, and what agency was responsible for his protection. "Which agency?" Chen asked immediately. Thompson shook his head. "I can't provide that information." Mitchell opened another folder and withdrew a document that had been faxed to Fort Riverside that morning. It was a personnel inquiry from the Defense Intelligence Agency, requesting information about any civilian contractors with advanced technical capabilities who might have accessed classified systems without proper authorization. "Mr. Thompson, this inquiry was generated by yesterday's incident. Multiple federal agencies are now investigating what happened in Building 7 Alpha, and your name is at the center of that investigation. If you're operating under some form of official protection, now would be an excellent time to provide contact information for the agency responsible for your situation." Thompson studied the document carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. Mitchell could see him processing the implications of multiple agency involvement and coming to conclusions that clearly troubled him. "I need to make a phone call," he said quietly. "To whom?" "Someone who can explain my situation better than I can." Mitchell exchanged glances with Chen. Allowing Thompson to contact outside parties could compromise their investigation, but it might also provide answers to questions that he seemed unwilling or unable to address directly. "You can make your call, but it will be monitored and recorded. And, Mr. Thompson, if you're thinking about warning anyone or arranging some form of extraction, I should mention that we have agents positioned around this facility and monitoring all communications." Thompson nodded, accepting the conditions without protest. Mitchell handed him a secure phone, and he dialed a number from memory, waiting through several rings before someone answered. "This is Blackbird 7, Thompson said, using what was clearly a code designation. "I need immediate contact with Control." Mitchell could hear voice on the other end of the call, but the words were indistinct. Thompson listened for nearly a minute before responding. "Fort Riverside, Nevada. Homeland Security agents Mitchell and Chen. They've connected incidents at Peterson, Norfolk, and Fort Meade." Another pause. "Yes, I understand the implications." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Thompson providing details about the previous day's events and answering questions that Mitchell couldn't hear. Finally, he handed the phone back to her. "Agent Mitchell, someone wants to speak with you." Mitchell took the phone cautiously. "This is Agent Mitchell, Homeland Security." The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, with the particular cadence that suggested military or intelligence background. "Agent Mitchell, this is Deputy Director Harrison from the National Security Agency. I understand you're investigating one of our former personnel." Mitchell felt her pulse quicken. NSA involvement confirmed her suspicions about Thompson's background, but it also meant that her investigation had just become infinitely more complicated. "Sir, we're investigating unauthorized access to classified systems at Fort Riverside. Mr. Thompson appears to have capabilities that exceed his official credentials." Quote, "Agent Mitchell, Dr. Thompson is operating under a protected identity that was established by this agency for his personal security. His current situation is the result of circumstances that required him to step away from active service, while maintaining the ability to contribute to national security when necessary." Mitchell processed this information quickly. Thompson wasn't just former NSA. He was operating under official protection with a cover identity that had been professionally constructed. That suggested his situation was far more serious than routine employment termination. "Sir, what circumstances required protected identity status?" There was a pause before Harrison responded. Dr. Thompson was the lead technical analyst on a classified operation that exposed foreign intelligence penetration of Allied communication systems. His testimony before congressional oversight committees resulted in prosecutions that created significant personal risk. The protected identity was established to ensure his safety while preserving his ability to serve when critical situations arose. Mitchell looked at Thompson, who was sitting quietly with an expression that suggested this conversation was resolving issues he'd been unable to address himself. His willingness to make the call indicated that he'd reached the conclusion that maintaining his cover was no longer possible. "Sir, what was Dr. Thompson's specific role at NSA?" "He was our senior specialist in SIGINT systems analysis and cryptographic security. His expertise in communication system vulnerabilities and defensive countermeasures was instrumental in identifying and countering several foreign intelligence operations. His work saved numerous Allied operations and probably prevented significant intelligence losses." Chen leaned forward, clearly following the conversation through Mitchell's expression and body language. The revelation that Thompson was a protected NSA witness explained the sophisticated cover identity and the advanced technical capabilities they'd observed. "Sir, Dr. Thompson's activities yesterday involved accessing classified systems at Fort Riverside. Can you confirm that he was authorized to perform that work?" Harrison's response came without hesitation. "Dr. Thompson retains emergency authorization to access NSA-compatible systems when critical situations require his expertise. His actions yesterday were consistent with his standing instructions to prevent intelligence community system failures when possible." Mitchell felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Thompson hadn't been acting outside his authority. He'd been following protocols that existed outside normal military channels. His repair work had been authorized by an agency that preferred to keep such authorizations invisible. "Sir, what should we do with Dr. Thompson now? His cover appears to be compromised. We'll be sending a team to extract him within the hour." "Agent Mitchell, I want to emphasize that Dr. Thompson's protected status is classified at the highest levels. Any reports you file should reflect that this investigation confirmed his authority to perform the work in question." The call ended, leaving Mitchell staring at Thompson with a completely different understanding of who he was and why he'd been living under an assumed identity. The quiet maintenance worker was actually one of NSA's former senior technical specialists, operating under witness protection while maintaining the ability to intervene in critical situations. "Dr. Thompson," she said, using his title for the first time, "it appears we owe you an apology. We didn't understand the nature of your situation." Thompson shook his head. "You were doing your job, Agent Mitchell. I couldn't explain my circumstances without compromising operational security. I appreciate your professionalism during a difficult situation." Chen closed his tablet and began packing his equipment. "Dr. Thompson, what happens now? Will you be relocating again?" "I don't know," Thompson replied honestly. "That decision will be made by people with better information than I have. But I suspect my time as a maintenance worker is over." Mitchell gathered her files, reflecting on the complexity of Thompson's situation. He'd sacrificed his career and identity to protect national security, only to have that sacrifice complicated by his inability to ignore critical problems when he encountered them. His expertise had saved Fort Riverside from a significant operational failure, but demonstrating that expertise had exposed him to exactly the kind of attention he'd been trying to avoid. "Dr. Thompson, for what it's worth, your work yesterday prevented what could have been a serious intelligence compromise. The communication systems you repaired were scheduled to handle time-sensitive operations that couldn't have been delayed." Thompson nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I knew the risks when I chose to intervene, but I couldn't stand by and watch critical systems fail when I had the knowledge to prevent it." Outside the conference room, Colonel Hayes was coordinating with NSA personnel who had arrived to handle Thompson's extraction. The base commander had learned more about her maintenance worker in the past few hours than she'd discovered during weeks of investigation, and she was struggling to process the implications of having had a protected NSA witness working unrecognized in her facility. The extraction team was efficient and professional, arriving in unmarked vehicles and coordinating Thompson's departure with minimal disruption to base operations. Hayes watched from her office window as Thompson gathered his belongings and prepared to leave Fort Riverside for what would probably be another carefully constructed identity in another anonymous location. She'd grown to respect the quiet contractor who'd solved problems without seeking credit and demonstrated expertise without demanding recognition. Learning that he was a decorated intelligence analyst operating under witness protection only increased her admiration for his dedication to service despite personal sacrifice. As the NSA vehicles departed, Hayes reflected on the irony that Thompson's attempt to help had ultimately compromised the very anonymity that had allowed him to continue serving his country. She hoped that wherever he went next, he would find a way to use his remarkable capabilities without having to hide who he was. In the lead vehicle, Thompson stared out at the Nevada desert as Fort Riverside disappeared behind them. He'd known this day would come eventually, but he'd hoped for more time to build something resembling a normal life. Now he was returning to a world of classified briefings and protected identities, where his expertise was valued, but his humanity was secondary to operational security. Deputy Director Harrison's voice came through the vehicle's secure communication system. "Marcus, we're sorry about the exposure. We know you were trying to maintain a low profile. I understand the situation, sir. I just couldn't let critical systems fail when I had the knowledge to prevent it. That's exactly why we need people like you, Marcus. Your commitment to the mission hasn't changed, even under difficult circumstances. We have a new assignment that will make better use of your capabilities, while providing better security for your situation." Thompson listened as Harrison outlined the new position, understanding that his time as an anonymous maintenance worker was indeed over. He would return to the intelligence community, but with enhanced protection and recognition of the sacrifices he'd made to serve his country. As the vehicles carrying Dr. Marcus Thompson disappeared into the desert distance, Fort Riverside returned to its routine operations. But the base personnel who had witnessed the quiet contractor's extraordinary capabilities would remember the incident for years, discussing among themselves the maintenance worker who had turned out to be far more than anyone had imagined. The story would become part of Fort Riverside's informal history, told and retold until it achieved almost legendary status. But the true details of Marcus Thompson's identity and the reasons for his presence would remain classified, known only to those with the highest levels of security clearance and the need to know. In the end, Thompson's brief time at Fort Riverside had demonstrated both the value and the vulnerability of the intelligence community's most dedicated personnel. His expertise had prevented a critical failure, but maintaining that level of capability required sacrifices that few people could understand or appreciate. The Nevada desert kept its secrets, as it always had, but Fort Riverside would never again take its maintenance personnel for granted. 3 weeks after Dr. Marcus Thompson's departure from Fort Riverside, the Nevada desert installation received an official memorandum from the Department of Defense that would fundamentally change how the base approached civilian-contractor relationships. The document, classified at the secret level and distributed only to senior command staff, outlined new protocols for recognizing and protecting personnel operating under federal witness protection programs. Colonel Patricia Hayes read the memorandum in her office as the morning sun cast long shadows across the base compound. The document didn't mention Thompson by name, but its timing and content made clear that his situation had prompted significant policy changes at the highest levels of military administration. The memorandum established procedures for identifying protected personnel, protocols for maintaining their security while utilizing their expertise, and channels for communicating with the agencies responsible for their oversight. More importantly for Hayes, the document included a commendation letter that she was authorized to read but not retain. The letter, signed by the director of the National Security Agency himself, praised Dr. Marcus Thompson's exceptional service during his assignment at Fort Riverside and acknowledged his critical role in preventing what the letter described as a potential intelligence compromise of international significance. According to the commendation, Thompson's repair of the SIGINT Array Processing Unit had occurred just hours before the system was scheduled to handle communications related to a time-sensitive counterintelligence operation. The environmental failure that Thompson had diagnosed and corrected would have forced a postponement of the operation, potentially allowing foreign intelligence services to complete activities that were under active surveillance. Hayes had known that Thompson's work was technically impressive, but she hadn't understood the broader implications of his intervention. The timing of the repair had been fortunate in ways that went far beyond preventing inconvenience or operational delays. Thompson had, quite literally, saved a critical intelligence operation without knowing the stakes involved. The letter also revealed details about Thompson's background that explained both his remarkable capabilities and his need for protected status. Dr. Marcus Thompson held advanced degrees in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT, had served as the NSA's senior technical analyst for SIGINT system security, and had been personally responsible for identifying vulnerabilities that had led to the exposure of a sophisticated foreign intelligence network. His work had resulted in the arrest and prosecution of 14 individuals involved in espionage activities targeting United States military communications. The prosecutions had effectively dismantled a foreign intelligence operation that had been active for nearly a decade. But they had also created significant personal risk for Thompson as the primary witness whose testimony had made the convictions possible. The protected identity that had brought him to Fort Riverside was part of a witness security program that allowed critical intelligence personnel to continue serving their country while remaining safe from retaliation. Thompson had volunteered for the program, accepting the sacrifice of his career and identity in order to protect ongoing operations and ensure that his expertise remained available when national security required it. Reading these details, Hayes felt a profound sense of respect for the man she had known only as a quiet maintenance contractor. Thompson had given up everything he had worked to achieve in order to serve a greater purpose, accepting anonymity and isolation, rather than allowing foreign intelligence services to silence his testimony through intimidation or worse. The memorandum concluded with instructions for Hayes to ensure that all personnel at Fort Riverside understood the classified nature of Thompson's true identity and the importance of maintaining operational security regarding his time at the base. The official record would show only that a contractor had performed routine maintenance work, with no mention of the advanced diagnostic capabilities or classified system access that had made his intervention possible. Hayes forwarded appropriate portions of the memorandum to her senior staff, emphasizing the need for discretion, while ensuring that lessons learned from Thompson's situation would improve future security protocols. She also made a point of speaking privately with Staff Sergeant Derek Sullivan, Corporal Tony Martinez, and Private First Class Kevin Walsh, the three enlisted personnel who had worked most closely with Thompson and observed his capabilities firsthand. Sullivan took the news about Thompson's real identity with a mixture of embarrassment and admiration. He had spent weeks dismissing the contractor as an overpaid civilian who didn't understand military procedures, only to learn that Thompson had been one of the intelligence community's most respected technical specialists. The knowledge that he had supervised someone whose expertise far exceeded his own was humbling, but it also provided valuable perspective on the importance of not judging people based on incomplete information. "Colonel, I have to admit that I completely misjudged Dr. Thompson," Sullivan said during their private meeting. "I saw what I expected to see rather than paying attention to what was actually happening. His knowledge and capabilities were extraordinary, but I was too focused on his civilian status to recognize what that meant." Martinez and Walsh had similar reactions, both expressing regret that they hadn't recognized Thompson's true value during his time at the base. Martinez, who had worked most closely with Thompson on technical repairs, admitted that he had learned more about advanced diagnostic procedures in a few weeks than he had in years of formal training. "Dr. Thompson never talked down to us or made us feel stupid for not understanding complex systems," Martinez explained. "But when you watched him work, you could see that he understood things at a level that none of us could match. I wish I had paid more attention to his methods instead of just assuming he was lucky." Walsh, as the youngest member of the group, was perhaps most affected by learning about Thompson's sacrifices. The idea that someone would give up their career and identity to protect national security made a profound impression on the young soldier, who had been struggling to understand his own role in the larger mission of the military. "It makes you think about what service really means," Walsh said. "Dr. Thompson wasn't wearing a uniform, wasn't getting recognition or promotion, but he was still serving his country in ways that most people will never know about. That kind of dedication is something to aspire to." Hayes was pleased to see that Thompson's example was having a positive effect on her personnel, inspiring them to think more deeply about their own responsibilities and the importance of their work. She arranged for additional training on recognizing and protecting personnel operating under special circumstances, using Thompson's situation as a case study while maintaining appropriate classification levels. Meanwhile, in a secure facility outside Washington, D.C., Dr. Marcus Thompson was adjusting to his new role as a senior technical consultant for the NSA's Defensive Countermeasures Division. His time at Fort Riverside had demonstrated that maintaining his anonymity while continuing to serve was more difficult than anyone had anticipated, leading to a reassignment that would make better use of his capabilities while providing enhanced security for his situation. Thompson's new position allowed him to work on the cutting-edge technical challenges that had defined his career, but with protections that his previous assignment had lacked. His office was located within a secure complex that housed other personnel operating under protected status, creating a community of individuals who understood the unique challenges of serving their country while maintaining carefully constructed identities. The work itself was both familiar and evolving, focusing on the development of defensive systems that could protect critical infrastructure from the increasingly sophisticated attacks being conducted by foreign intelligence services. Thompson's experience with both offensive and defensive capabilities made him uniquely qualified to anticipate attack vectors and develop countermeasures that could adapt to emerging threats. But, perhaps more satisfying than the technical challenges, was the opportunity to mentor younger analysts who were beginning their careers in the intelligence community. Thompson's experience at Fort Riverside had reinforced his belief that the most important work often happened at the intersection of technical expertise and human judgment, where individual decisions could have consequences far beyond their immediate scope. He found himself sharing lessons learned not just from his years with the NSA, but from his time as a maintenance contractor in the Nevada desert. The importance of paying attention to details that others might overlook, the value of persistence in solving complex problems, and the necessity of maintaining professional standards even when working under difficult circumstances. The most critical systems often fail in ways that aren't covered by standard procedures, Thompson explained to a group of junior analysts during one of his regular training sessions. Your technical knowledge gives you the tools to understand what's happening, but your judgment determines whether you'll take the risks necessary to prevent serious consequences. Thompson's students were eager to learn from someone whose reputation for technical excellence was matched by his demonstrated willingness to act when critical situations required intervention. His experience at Fort Riverside had become part of his legend within the intelligence community, a story of expertise applied under pressure, with results that had prevented significant operational failures. Back at Fort Riverside, the lessons learned from Thompson's time at the base were being incorporated into new training programs and operational procedures. Hayes had commissioned a comprehensive review of how the base identified and utilized specialized personnel, with particular attention to improving recognition of capabilities that might not be reflected in official documentation. The review had identified several areas where the base could improve its approach to civilian contractor management, including better coordination with agencies that might place specialized personnel in routine positions for security reasons. New protocols were established for reporting unusual technical capabilities to appropriate oversight bodies, ensuring that future situations like Thompson's would be handled more effectively. Dr. James Carter, the base technical director who had first recognized the sophisticated nature of Thompson's work, was asked to develop training materials that would help military personnel identify advanced technical capabilities regardless of a person's official job description. Carter's experience working with Thompson had given him insights into the kinds of behaviors and knowledge that indicated specialized training. Dr. Thompson's diagnostic methodology was textbook NSA, Carter explained to Hayes during one of their planning meetings. If our technical staff had been trained to recognize those indicators, we could have identified his background much earlier and handled his situation more appropriately. The training program that Carter developed focused on helping military personnel understand the difference between routine technical competence and the kind of advanced expertise that indicated specialized government training. The program used sanitized examples from Thompson's work to illustrate diagnostic techniques and problem-solving approaches that were characteristic of intelligence community personnel. Lisa Park, the base security officer who had noticed details about Thompson that others had missed, was promoted to a new position overseeing contractor security protocols. Her ability to observe and analyze behavioral patterns had proven valuable in identifying potential security issues, and her experience with Thompson's situation made her uniquely qualified to develop improved screening procedures. Park's new protocols included regular security briefings for personnel working with civilian contractors, emphasizing the importance of reporting unusual capabilities or behaviors to appropriate authorities. The goal was not to create an atmosphere of suspicion, but to ensure that specialized personnel operating under protected status would be identified and supported rather than ignored or dismissed. Dr. Thompson's situation taught us that the people who seem most ordinary might actually be the most extraordinary, Park explained to her security team. Our job isn't to investigate every contractor, but to pay attention to details that might indicate someone needs special consideration or protection. The changes at Fort Riverside were part of a broader transformation taking place across military installations as the Department of Defense adapted to the realities of modern intelligence operations. The increasing sophistication of foreign intelligence activities had made it necessary to place specialized personnel in a variety of roles and locations, often without the knowledge or understanding of local commanders. Thompson's experience had highlighted both the value and the vulnerability of this approach. His expertise had prevented a significant operational failure, but his exposure had compromised carefully constructed protections that had taken years to establish. The challenge was finding ways to utilize specialized personnel effectively while maintaining the security that kept them safe. 6 months after leaving Fort Riverside, Thompson received a letter from Colonel Hayes, expressing her gratitude for his service and updating him on the positive changes his situation had inspired. The letter, delivered through official NSA channels, conveyed the respect and admiration of the Fort Riverside personnel who had worked with him. Your example has inspired changes that will benefit both military operations and personnel security for years to come, Hayes wrote. The quiet professionalism you demonstrated while working under difficult circumstances embodies the best traditions of service to our country. Thompson kept the letter in his secure office, a reminder of the time when he had found satisfaction in solving routine problems with extraordinary expertise. His current work was intellectually challenging and professionally rewarding, but he sometimes missed the simplicity of fixing broken systems without the complexity of bureaucratic oversight and security protocols. The experience at Fort Riverside had taught him that service could take many forms, and that sometimes the most important work happened when no one was watching or keeping score. His willingness to risk exposure in order to prevent a critical system failure had been driven by the same commitment to excellence that had defined his entire career, regardless of his official title or recognition. As Thompson continued his work in the classified world of defensive cybersecurity, he carried with him the knowledge that expertise without wisdom was incomplete, and that true service required the courage to act when circumstances demanded it, even when personal costs were involved. His time as a maintenance contractor had been brief, but it had reinforced lessons about duty and sacrifice that would guide him for the rest of his career. The story of Dr. Marcus Thompson would remain classified for decades, known only to those with the highest security clearances, and the need to understand how the intelligence community protected its most valuable personnel. But the principles his example had demonstrated, the importance of recognizing hidden worth and the value of quiet dedication to duty, would influence military and intelligence operations for generations. At Fort Riverside, his legacy lived on in improved procedures, better training, and a heightened awareness of the extraordinary capabilities that might be hidden behind ordinary appearances. The base had learned to look beyond official job descriptions and formal credentials to recognize the true measure of the people who serve their country in all its varied forms. The Nevada desert kept its secrets, as it always had, but Fort Riverside would never again underestimate the maintenance worker who solved impossible problems with extraordinary skill. In a world where heroes often remained hidden and service went unrecognized, Dr. Marcus Thompson had demonstrated that true excellence revealed itself not through titles or ceremonies, but through actions taken when no one was watching and everything was at stake. 2 years after Dr. Marcus Thompson's departure from Fort Riverside, a young Army specialist named David Chen arrived at the Nevada installation, with orders assigning him to the Base Communications Division. Chen carried with him a degree in computer science from Stanford and enough student debt to make military service an attractive option for launching his career. What he didn't carry was any knowledge of the quiet maintenance contractor, whose brief presence had transformed how Fort Riverside approached the intersection of expertise and expectation. Chen's first assignment was routine systems maintenance in Building 7 Alpha, the same secure facility where Thompson had demonstrated capabilities that defied his official job description. The building's environmental controls had been upgraded significantly since Thompson's intervention, but the fundamental challenge of maintaining complex systems in the harsh desert environment remained constant. Staff Sergeant Derek Sullivan, now promoted and serving as the Senior Technical Supervisor for the Communications Division, was assigned to orient Chen to his new responsibilities. Sullivan's experience with Thompson had fundamentally changed his approach to personnel management, making him more attentive to capabilities that might not be reflected in official documentation. "Chen, I want you to understand something important about working in this facility," Sullivan explained as they walked through the basement corridors where Thompson had once diagnosed critical system failures. "The equipment we maintain here is worth more than most people make in a lifetime, and the operations it supports can affect national security. Your official job description says maintenance technician, but what we really need from you is problem-solving intelligence." Chen nodded, absorbing Sullivan's words while taking in the impressive array of technical systems surrounding them. The young soldier had expected routine maintenance work, but the sophistication of the equipment suggested that his assignment would be more challenging than he'd anticipated. "I've learned that the most valuable people in technical operations aren't necessarily the ones with the highest rank or the most impressive credentials," Sullivan continued. "They're the ones who can see problems that others miss and find solutions that others can't imagine. Your Stanford degree is impressive, but what matters here is whether you can think creatively under pressure." The conversation represented a complete reversal from Sullivan's earlier attitudes toward civilian education and unconventional problem-solving approaches. Thompson's example had taught him that dismissing capabilities based on preconceptions was not just unfair to individuals, but potentially dangerous to operations that depended on creative technical solutions. Chen's introduction to Fort Riverside's changed culture continued during his first week, as he encountered personnel at every level who had been influenced by lessons learned from Thompson's time at the base. Captain Jennifer Lee, who had authorized Thompson's access to Building 7 Alpha during the critical repair, now served as the base's liaison with federal agencies that placed specialized personnel in civilian contractor positions. Lee's new role had been created specifically to address situations like Thompson's, ensuring that personnel operating under protected status would be identified and supported, rather than left to navigate military bureaucracy without appropriate guidance. Her office maintained secure communication channels with multiple federal agencies, allowing for rapid verification of credentials and coordination of support when unusual situations arose. "We learned that assuming people are exactly what their paperwork says they are can create serious problems," Lee explained to Chen during a security briefing. "Now we have protocols for recognizing when someone's capabilities suggest a background that isn't reflected in their official file. It's not about being suspicious of everyone, but about being alert to indicators that someone might need special consideration." Chen found these briefings fascinating, particularly the emphasis on recognizing advanced technical capabilities that might indicate specialized government training. The training materials developed by Dr. James Carter, based on his observations of Thompson's work, provided detailed examples of diagnostic techniques and problem-solving approaches that were characteristic of intelligence community personnel. The training included video examples of advanced troubleshooting methods, carefully sanitized to protect classified information, while illustrating the difference between routine technical competence and the kind of sophisticated expertise that indicated specialized background. Chen studied these materials intently, understanding that his ability to recognize such capabilities in others might be crucial to base security and operations. Lisa Park, now the base's senior security coordinator for contractor oversight, conducted additional briefings that focused on behavioral indicators and security protocols. Park's promotion had been directly related to her ability to observe details about Thompson that others had missed, and her new position reflected the base's commitment to improving personnel security. Dr. Thompson taught us that the most dangerous assumption is that ordinary appearance equals ordinary capability, Park explained to Chen's training group. Our job isn't to interrogate every contractor, but to pay attention to patterns of behavior and knowledge that might indicate someone needs additional support or protection. Park's training emphasized the importance of creating an environment where personnel with unusual backgrounds could seek help when needed, rather than feeling compelled to maintain cover identities at the expense of operational effectiveness. The goal was to balance security requirements with the practical needs of people who might be serving their country in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Chen's first major test came during his third week at Fort Riverside, when a power surge damaged several critical systems in the communications facility. The failure occurred during a routine thunderstorm, but its effects were far more serious than typical weather-related outages. Multiple backup systems had been compromised, and standard repair procedures weren't adequate to restore full functionality. Sullivan assigned Chen to assist with the emergency repairs, working alongside a team of civilian contractors who had been called in to address the most complex system failures. The young soldier found himself observing carefully as the contractors worked, applying the training he'd received about recognizing advanced technical capabilities. One contractor in particular caught Chen's attention. The woman, who appeared to be in her 40s with graying hair and calloused hands, moved through the damaged systems with an efficiency that reminded Chen of the video examples he'd studied in training. Her diagnostic approach was systematic and sophisticated, following protocols that seemed more advanced than routine contractor procedures. "Ma'am, that troubleshooting sequence you're using isn't in any of the manuals I've seen," Chen observed, trying to keep his tone conversational rather than suspicious. The contractor looked up from her work, studying Chen's expression carefully. "Sometimes, experience teaches you methods that aren't documented in official procedures. These systems are more complex than they appear, and conventional approaches don't always work." Chen nodded, but continued to watch as the contractor accessed diagnostic interfaces that he wasn't sure were covered by civilian clearances. Her familiarity with the systems went beyond routine maintenance knowledge, suggesting background with similar installations that might indicate specialized government experience. Following the protocols he'd learned in training, Chen discreetly contacted Lisa Park to report his observations. Park responded immediately, initiating verification procedures that had been established specifically to address situations like Thompson's. Within hours, Park's investigation confirmed that the contractor was indeed operating under federal protection, working for an agency that preferred to keep its personnel invisible, while utilizing their expertise for critical repairs. The woman was a former Air Force technical officer who had specialized in communication system security before accepting assignment to a witness protection program. Unlike Thompson's situation, where his background had been discovered only after security concerns arose, the new protocols allowed Park to identify and support the contractor before any problems developed. The woman was able to complete her repairs effectively while receiving appropriate security support, demonstrating that the lessons learned from Thompson's experience had practical value. Chen's role in identifying the situation earned him recognition from his supervisors, but more importantly, it reinforced his understanding of the complex realities underlying military operations. The base was populated by people whose official roles might not reflect their actual capabilities or backgrounds, and being alert to these possibilities was an important part of maintaining operational security. The experience also connected Chen to a broader network of personnel who had been influenced by Thompson's legacy. Colonel Patricia Hayes, now promoted to Brigadier General and serving at the Pentagon, maintained a regular contact with Fort Riverside to monitor the effectiveness of the policy changes that had been implemented following Thompson's situation. Hayes had become a recognized expert on personnel security issues related to witness protection programs and specialized contractor management. Her experience with Thompson had provided valuable insights that were being applied at military installations around the world, improving both operational effectiveness and personnel security. Dr. Thompson's situation taught us that the intersection between expertise and security is more complex than traditional military doctrine recognized, Hayes explained during a video conference with Fort Riverside's senior staff. We needed new approaches that could protect people while utilizing their capabilities effectively. The policy changes that had originated at Fort Riverside were now being implemented throughout the Department of Defense, creating standardized procedures for identifying and supporting personnel operating under federal protection. Hayes had been instrumental in developing these policies, drawing on her direct experience with the challenges and opportunities that such personnel represented. Chen learned about these broader implications during advanced training sessions that were now required for all personnel working with civilian contractors. The training included case studies based on Thompson's situation, though the details were carefully sanitized to protect classified information, while conveying important lessons about recognition and support. The most powerful element of the training was testimony from personnel who had worked directly with Thompson, including Sullivan, Martinez, and Walsh. Their accounts of initially dismissing Thompson's capabilities, then gradually recognizing his expertise, provided compelling examples of how preconceptions could blind people to extraordinary abilities. I spent weeks treating Dr. Thompson like he was just another contractor who didn't understand military procedures, Sullivan admitted during one training session. But he understood those procedures better than I did, and he had capabilities that I couldn't even recognize. My assumptions made me a less effective supervisor and potentially compromised base security. Martinez's testimony focused on the technical aspects of Thompson's work, describing diagnostic procedures and problem-solving approaches that had been far more advanced than anything covered in military training. Dr. Thompson never made us feel stupid for not understanding complex systems, but watching him work was like getting a graduate-level education in advanced technology. Walsh, now promoted to sergeant and serving as a technical instructor, emphasized the broader lessons about service and dedication that Thompson's example had provided. Dr. Thompson showed us that real service isn't about recognition or rank. It's about using your capabilities to solve problems and protect operations, regardless of whether anyone knows who you are or what you've sacrificed. These testimonials had a profound impact on Chen and his fellow trainees, helping them understand that their roles in military operations extended beyond their official job descriptions. They were part of a larger community of service that included people whose contributions might never be publicly acknowledged, but whose dedication was essential to national security. Chen's understanding of these concepts was tested again during his second year at Fort Riverside, when he was assigned to work with a contractor who exhibited behavioral patterns similar to those described in his training. The contractor, a middle-aged man with extensive knowledge of satellite communication systems, demonstrated capabilities that seemed inconsistent with his civilian background. This time, Chen's response was immediate and appropriate. He documented his observations, reported them through established channels, and coordinated with security personnel to ensure that the contractor received appropriate support. The verification process confirmed that the man was a former NSA technician working under protected status, and proper protocols were implemented to support his mission while maintaining his security. The successful handling of this situation demonstrated that the changes inspired by Thompson's experience had created lasting improvements in how Fort Riverside managed personnel with unusual backgrounds. Chen had applied lessons learned from Thompson's situation to support another person in similar circumstances, creating a positive cycle of recognition and protection. As Chen advanced in his military career, he carried with him the understanding that service took many forms, and that the most important contributions often came from people whose backgrounds weren't reflected in their official documentation. His experience at Fort Riverside had taught him to look beyond superficial appearances and to recognize that extraordinary capabilities could be hidden behind ordinary job descriptions. The ripple effects of Thompson's time at Fort Riverside continued to expand as personnel who had learned from his example moved to other assignments and shared their knowledge with new communities. Sullivan, promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned to a communications training facility, incorporated lessons from Thompson's situation into curriculum development for technical personnel throughout the Army. Martinez, now a staff sergeant serving at a different installation, used his experience with Thompson to mentor junior personnel and help them develop more sophisticated approaches to technical problem solving. His understanding of advanced diagnostic procedures, learned through observation of Thompson's work, made him a more effective instructor and supervisor. Walsh, completing his bachelor's degree through military education programs, had chosen to focus his studies on the intersection of technology and national security, directly inspired by Thompson's example of quiet service in support of larger missions. His career trajectory had been fundamentally influenced by his brief exposure to someone whose dedication transcended personal recognition. Dr. James Carter, the technical director who had first recognized the sophisticated nature of Thompson's work, had been promoted to a Pentagon position where he helped develop policy for managing specialized technical personnel across all military services. His experience with Thompson had provided crucial insights that were shaping how the Department of Defense approached the challenges of modern warfare. Lisa Park, now a commissioned officer specializing in personnel security, had become a recognized expert in contractor management and witness protection coordination. Her ability to recognize behavioral indicators developed through her observations of Thompson had made her an invaluable resource for installations dealing with similar challenges. The policy changes that had originated from Thompson's situation were now embedded in military doctrine, creating standardized approaches to recognizing and supporting personnel whose capabilities exceeded their official credentials. Training programs based on lessons learned at Fort Riverside were being implemented at installations around the world. Even Colonel Hayes, now serving in a senior Pentagon position, continued to draw on her experience with Thompson as she developed broader policies for personnel security and contractor management. Her understanding of the human elements involved in these situations had made her an effective advocate for approaches that balanced security requirements with recognition of individual contributions. The most profound impact of Thompson's legacy, however, was on the countless personnel who had learned to look beyond official job descriptions to recognize the true capabilities of the people around them. Chen and his contemporaries represented a generation of military professionals who understood that service came in many forms and that the most important contributions often went unrecognized. As Chen prepared for his next assignment, he reflected on the lessons he'd learned during his time at Fort Riverside. The base had taught him that expertise and dedication could be found in unexpected places, that assumptions based on appearance or credentials could blind people to extraordinary capabilities, and that true service meant supporting others regardless of whether their contributions would ever be publicly acknowledged. Thompson's brief time as a maintenance contractor had created changes that would influence military operations for decades. His willingness to risk exposure in order to prevent a critical system failure had demonstrated principles of service that transcended rank, recognition, and personal security. The ripple effects of his example continued to spread, inspiring better policies, improved training, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve one's country. In secure facilities around the world, other personnel operating under protected identities continued their quiet service, supported by systems and policies that had been improved through lessons learned from Thompson's experience. They worked in anonymity, their contributions known only to those with the highest security clearances, but their dedication protected by institutions that had learned to recognize and value their sacrifices. The story of Dr. Marcus Thompson would remain classified for years to come, but the principles his example had demonstrated would continue to influence how the military and intelligence communities approached the complex relationships between expertise, security, and service. His legacy lived on in improved policies, better training, and most importantly, in the countless individuals who had learned to recognize and protect the extraordinary capabilities that might be hidden behind ordinary appearances. Fort Riverside continued its mission in the Nevada desert, its personnel now alert to the possibility that the most important contributions might come from the most unexpected sources. The base had learned that heroes didn't always wear uniforms or carry impressive credentials, but they could always be recognized by their willingness to act when circumstances demanded it, regardless of personal cost or public recognition. The desert kept its secrets as it always had, but Fort Riverside would never again underestimate the maintenance worker who solved impossible problems or dismiss the contractor whose capabilities exceeded expectations. In a world where service often went unrecognized and sacrifice remained hidden, Thompson's example had created lasting change that would protect and support future generations of quiet heroes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.